delay your caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking up on most days. And I'll be very clear as to days in which you might want to ingest caffeine more closely to when you wake up. Why would you want to delay your caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking? The answer to that is very simple. Many people wake up in the morning, they drink caffeine within 10, 20, 30, sometimes within 2 minutes of waking, and they feel more alert, naturally. That makes sense. But then what they find is that in the early afternoon, in particular after lunch, they experience a dramatic dip in their overall levels of energy, the so-called afternoon crash. And in most cases, the way they respond to that is to ingest more caffeine, which indeed can increase their levels of mood and alertness. However, as we'll soon talk about, there is a problem with ingesting caffeine in the afternoon if it falls within 8 or 10, or dare I even say 12 hours of going to sleep. And that is the caffeine ingested in the afternoon for most everybody, I'd say for 95+% of people, disrupts the architecture and quality of their nighttime sleep. And I should say that it doesn't necessarily impact their ability to fall asleep and maybe even sleep through the night, but that the depth and quality of that sleep is disrupted by consuming caffeine in the afternoon. A little bit later, I'll talk about how you can offset some of those negative effects if you absolutely require caffeine in the afternoon. But there's a huge advantage to restricting your caffeine intake to the early part of your day, but not consuming caffeine within the first 90 to 120 minutes after waking. In fact, many people find that if they delay their caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking up, that they feel more alert in the morning and they completely avoid that afternoon crash. Talking about the afternoon crash is a inability to recover energy and focus and a need to consume more caffeine just to make it through the afternoon. By delaying caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking, there are a couple of things that are accomplished. First of all, you offset that afternoon crash, and this is an effect that many people experience the very first time they start delaying their caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking. And the reason this works so well is the following. As I mentioned earlier, adenosine is a molecule that builds up the longer that we are awake. It is a molecule that is reduced or cleared from our system by sleep. So when we emerge from sleep, regardless of how long we've slept, our adenosine levels are lower than they were when we went to sleep the previous night. If you slept well enough and long enough, those adenosine levels can be very, very low, but they are never completely zero. When you wake up in the morning, even if you're one of these people that springs out of bed and is ready to attack the day, and here I'm certainly not describing myself, I'm not one of those people. I tend to wake fairly slowly. But if you're one of those spring up and attack the day, or you're one of the people who moves more slowly into your day, regardless, there's still some residual adenosine in your system. And this is particularly the case if you did not get enough sleep or enough depth of sleep the night before. Now I'd like to talk about caffeine and its positive effects on performance when used correctly. And here we are referring to both mental performance and physical performance. If one examines reaction time, mood, alertness, focus, and memory, or the ability to call up information from memory, or physical dexterity, power output, endurance, and overall feelings of well-being during exercise and exertion, caffeine has been shown in numerous studies in both men and women to improve all of those metrics significantly. So this is all just to say that caffeine is an incredible performance-enhancing tool. If you look at the half-life of caffeine and you look at its effects on the dopamine system and its performance-enhancing effects, and how a period of abstinence can, in fact, increase the performance-enhancing effects of caffeine, but also take into consideration that caffeine can be habit-forming and we can develop a sort of tolerance to caffeine, well, then what emerges from all of that is that being a person who consumes caffeine every other day can actually help you maximize most of the positive effects of caffeine without subjecting you to the kind of misery that occurs if you're accustomed to consuming caffeine every single day and then suddenly go into a 2 or 5 or 20 day abstinence. So I myself have never tried an every other day caffeine approach. although I'm considering doing it based on the literature that I've read. And I'm considering doing it in a very specific way, which would be to only consume caffeine on the days in which I resistance train. And since I tend to do that about 3 or 4 days per week, organized in a way that's every other day. The every other day schedule of caffeine intake, to me, seems like the most rational one if one wants to maximize on the performance enhancing effects of caffeine without suffering the effects of caffeine withdrawal that are associated with being a regular consumer of caffeine and then stopping caffeine intake, such as headache and irritability and so forth. Not I nor anyone in my life wants me to experience those effects, and I'm sure you don't want to experience those effects for you either. At least by my read of the literature on caffeine and its performance-enhancing effects, but also the effects of caffeine on neurotransmitter and hormone systems, the every other day caffeine schedule does seem to be the most rational and scientifically grounded one in order to maximize on all those effects.